Thank you. In order to comply with Section 2.2, 3712D of the Code of Virginia, it is necessary for the board to certify that since the Fairfax County School Board convened a closed meeting on September 16th, 2019, to the best of each member's knowledge, only public business matters lawfully exempted from open meeting requirements and only such public business matters as were identified in the motion convening the closed meeting were heard, discussed, or considered by the board during this closed meeting. Do I have somebody making the motion? Made by Ms. McLaughlin, seconded by Ms. Strauss. All those in favor? That's Mr. Wilson, Mr. McElveen. That's unanimous with some on the sidelines having over here. Okay, that motion carries.
Very good. Thank you very much. So we're now going to discuss the procedures for naming school facilities. Well, actually, we're discussing renaming specifically, and we're going to be looking both at the policy and the proposed reg, the proposed policy change and the proposed reg. I'm wearing two hats today because I'm both meeting manager and as chair of governance. I'll just very briefly present the Governance Committee's proposed revisions. If you could pull those up for us, that would be helpful. So the Governance Committee was tasked with changing the compelling need language in the renaming piece of our naming policies. We are proposing changing two sentences. And if you could go up to 3, we are suggesting adding the underlined phrase here, school names as well as mascots associated with those names shall be consistent with the One Fairfax policy. And then further on down, our second proposed change is to remove where there's a compelling need and replace it with to ensure consistency with our One Fairfax policy or when the board deems it appropriate. So that's the Governance Committee's recommendation on the policy piece. And with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Brabrand to discuss the regulation, the proposed regulation changes. And Madam Clerk, if you could then call up the proposed regulation.
Actually, Madam Clerk, could we go back to the PowerPoint and then do you mind if I just finish the PowerPoint and then we can look at the regulation in detail if we want? So we're talking about procedures for naming school facilities and dedicating areas of school facilities or grounds, as Ms. Evans said. If you go to the next slide, this is the policy discussion, and Ms. Evans just led you through. Really, governance just made very, very slight tweaks to the policy. But this was something that was discussed doing at the last work session. I want to remind the board that what the forum topic request was in February. It was to modify our school naming renaming policy in an effort to ensure an inclusive, respectful learning environment as outlined in our adopted One Fairfax policy. And again, you just saw Ms. Evans sharing that the policy did have just a few brief tweaks to make that reference. And the other thing from the forum topic request was the superintendent would share proposed changes to the working progress for Regulation 8170. So that's really what I'm going to talk about now, and just lead you back again through a little bit of context and background. If we can go to the next slide, slide 4. At the July 15th work session, we shared with you, based on your forum topic, schools that were named after Confederate soldiers, schools that were named after individuals or families with Confederate ties. We also shared the primary and secondary sources for the history of the school names. And at the work session, the superintendent would share proposed changes to the working progress for Regulation 8170. Those things were all done on the 15th. If we can go to the next slide. We did make a few tweaks because board members kind of gave us feedback that some additional clarity would be helpful. So you see the language from July 15th proposed. The September revision I'm bringing you today keeps the same language of the July regulation, but I did add in, just so there's a little more specific, such an action, and you can see it's colored a little blue, Such an action will be initiated through a board forum topic by at least one magisterial school board member representing students attending that facility and one at-large school board member. A vote will be taken by the board through its regular meeting agenda process to proceed with the name change request. So we wanted to give you language about, well, how does the whole process even get started? And we feel like the regulation provides a little more clarification for that. If you go to slide 6, we had language around the renaming and public comment. And on the September 16th, we clarified the time period to be a 2-week period of public comment, which may include a public hearing between new business and final action of the school board to proceed with the name change request. We also made it a little bit clear that during the initial comment period, members of the community may submit renaming suggestions to the school board for consideration, and staff will distribute public announcements to the community of the board's request for comment and renaming suggestions. So a little bit more specificity there. That's B. If you'll go to slide 7, this is section C. Again, here we did just tweak, again, a little bit more clarity on the specific process and on the timeline. For our September revision, we said following the board's vote to proceed with the name change request, at least one magisterial school board member representing students attending the facility and one at large will, with staff support, which was one of the pieces of feedback this board asked about, would compile and review suggestions from the community and forward the recommendations to the entire school board for the consideration and action. And there'll be a 2-week period of public comment, which may include a public hearing between new business and final action of the school board to adopt the name or the new name for the school facility. That, I think, is it. I did have one other thing that I think would help the board before we take questions. One of your colleagues sent a question into me last night. And we've had staff work this morning just to try to take all this wordy language and maybe lay it out a little bit more. And I believe we have that available from the.
It's been posted.
It's been posted. Could we just call that up so I could? Okay. While I'm doing that, I actually brought some hard copies. If you do, folks feel like they need a hard copy, but this is under the regulation I've proposed. Is the renaming process, really, if you break down the regulation. So the school board would have a forum topic. The topic would be about renaming a school. If there was consensus from the board, we would move to step 2. Step 2 would be a regular school board meeting where it would be new business to change the name of the school. There would be a public comment or public hearing period between that board meeting and the new business item to a board meeting where there would be action to vote to change the name of the school. If the vote is no, there would be no further consideration of that name change. If the vote is yes, then the school board at another school board meeting as a new business item would list what the new name or list of names for consideration would be. There would then be a public comment or public hearing on those list of names, and then there would be a regular school board meeting to take action on voting on the name of the school. So I just thought this was a visual asked for by one of your colleagues, and I had staff develop this so you can perhaps better understand the regulation and ask any questions that you may.
Thank you, Dr. Brabrand. First question from Ms. Keys-Gamarra.
So is Mr. Foster here? Okay. Well, I don't know if you want to go ahead, because a lot of my questions will require his clarification from council.
Do you want us to move on
So you can
and
come back to me
you?
if yeah.
Okay. Ms. Schultz?
So,
Here he comes. Here he comes. Thank you. Nah, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Schultz. All right. Ms. Keys-Gamarra?
Okay, so Mr. Foster, as you know, I have asked some questions about this regulation, and I really was trying to get to the genesis or the basis of the superintendent's ability to delineate which board members would make decisions. And I think we need to go back probably to the first slide. I'm sorry, I don't have that in front of me. That talks about how these decisions will be made, requiring a magisterial, at least one magisterial from the district where the school is located,
Slide 5.
and then an at-large member. So I want to talk about, Mr. Foster, at some point, was the authority to delineate that delegated to the superintendent? That authority to make that designation within the regulation?
I'm sorry, what's the question?
I'm trying to understand, and I could be, I may have a misunderstanding, but when I look at the statutes, it appears to me that the school board has the authority to direct the superintendent. I do not know of a statute allowing the superintendent to direct the board, so I am assuming that the board at some point directed the superintendent to write up a policy, which then directed the board.
So, Ms. Keys-Gamarra, do you have a series of legal questions that you wanted to ask Mr. Foster?
I'm not sure this is actually a legal question. It's a timing with respect to, because the underlying question has to do with how the superintendent's authority with respect to this regulation is directing the board. I'm trying to understand how that happens. I'm assuming it happens through delegation of that authority.
Right, so I'll try and speak to how this proposed language got to where it is, and then I certainly can answer any follow-on questions. So, as you noted, Ms. Keys-Gamarra, in the draft regulation, the proposed language does include language whereby both a magisterial member as well as an at-large member of the board would need to be bringing forward the possibility of changing the name of a school. That language is in the existing regulation.
I understand that.
That has been in place, and I don't have the exact date, but it's been in place for several years. As I had advised the board, as a matter of law, school systems and school boards can choose to adopt different procedures, including procedures that are more onerous than simply a majority requirement, and including procedures, as in this case, that would require both an at-large and magisterial member to bring forward a name change.
But I want to get to the, well, I want to get to, because I read your memo, and I don't want to dig into that too deeply.
Sure.
I want to get to the power of the superintendent to direct the board. And that, it seems to me, is a fairly simple answer, in that the board must have delegated some authority to the superintendent for that to happen. Is that correct?
So I can say that generally, under the way that things are structured at Fairfax County Public Schools, the superintendent and his team bring forward proposed regulations. You all know that. And as is provided in Regulation 1102, if the school board does not like a regulation that is in place, and by implication a regulation that is proposed, it can veto that regulation. And so at the end of the day, it is the board that has the authority to determine whether it is going to follow a regulation that's proposed or allow that regulation to be adopted. Anyway, I don't know if that answers.
No, it doesn't, because my question goes to the authority in the first place. And my fundamental concern is that I presume, council is not saying that this school board has a duty to review all of our regulations to make sure that they don't go beyond the authority that is given to the superintendent as opposed to the board. So my question goes more specifically to the authority, which I believe was a delegated authority initially to the superintendent with respect to a direction from the superintendent to the board as to how it would operate its function. I'm assuming that was delegated authority. Is that correct?
So this is how I reached my conclusion. If the board does not like what the superintendent is doing or is proposed, the board can tell the superintendent, we're vetoing what you're proposing.
Can you
And so-
add- can
okay, and if I could please finish. You clearly disagree with that advice and that conclusion, which is your
No, what I
prerogative, which is your
disagree with-
prerogative as a board member. Having said that, I am retained and hired to provide conclusions and advice. And if the client does not want to follow the advice, the client can elect not to follow it. I will also say that the questions that you have raised on around the table this afternoon were also looked at by the Hunton and Williams law firm with a second opinion. They agreed with my conclusions. So I don't know what more I can say or do to address your questions.
Because it doesn't go to where the source of the authority came from in the first place. That's where my disagreement is.
So, Ms.
So I will
Keys-Gamarra,
move
can I put
on
you
to
on
my
a-
second question.
Well, Ms. Keys-Gamarra, can I put you on a go back then? It's 3 minutes. Ms. Schultz?
I'm entirely unsure, actually, of, I mean, I know we had a previous conversation about this. I don't feel like what has manifested here is even, I really, basically, I don't understand what the point of this name change policy is. And I'm saying that to my governance colleagues, if it came out of governance this way. The notion that one magisterial school board member and one at-large member could just decide, basically, to change the name of a school. Yeah, actually, the compelling need definition was removed. First of all, the whole change the name policy that was architected in its previously or currently constituted form was designed under this guise of a compelling need in order to target a certain school and potentially other schools with the same characteristic. Now, what we're saying is, we no longer need a compelling need. We can just do it. And it can be a magisterial and a at-large member, and off we go to the races. And there's no public comment that's driving the change. It's two board members deciding the change, and then you go to the public, but you've already made the decision. I mean, this is another instance where we've reverse engineered the way decision-making should be. That these are, I've said this many, many times, they are public schools with public money for the public benefit. They're not our schools. And this doesn't look like any ideas originate from a community. And I'll use as for example, we had somebody come to us at a board meeting last week and sort of beseech, a name change, either not for a school or maybe an auditorium, or I forget what it was, and made a compelling case, and maybe there's some community background there that I don't know about, over a significant individual. That's the grassroots of the way this should be organic and come from the community. This is an imposition of two board members' will to change a school board, a school name change, and then to engineer a process where the public comment comes afterwards. But they basically predetermined that the change needs to be made. And we've seen many, many times that the community can come to us in droves, by 100, by 500, by 1,000 in the case of Clifton Elementary. It doesn't matter. because in the end, the board's going to make the decision that the board's going to make. So I really don't understand this process at all, and what it's intending to do or why. I don't understand the why.
I think Dr. Brabrand wanted to make a comment.
Well, it may be helpful on both comments. Again, slide 3 is there was a forum topic from the board. The board, from Ms. Derenak Kofax. So the board met and discussed it, and out of the request came to modify the naming, renaming policy to ensure an inclusive, respectful learning environment as outlined by 1 Fairfax. It also directed me as staff to share proposed changes.
But I asked, though, the key is, why remove compelling need? By removing compelling need, you're taking away that there's an underpinning urgent reason to do something, and it becomes at the whim of 2 school board members.
Well, Ms.
And
Schultz,
that's insidious.
I will point out that we had a work session in which this board directed the governance committee to take compelling need out and replace it with something else, which is why our policy was changed.
I renew my objection to removing compelling need.
Okay, Mr. McElveen?
Okay, great. Thank you to the governance committee for bringing this forward. Thank you to Dr. Brabrand for his suggested language. I do feel this takes into account my concerns that were raised at our previous work session, which were about staff support. I was worried that the 2 board members would be out there flailing, trying to find people to help them run a community engagement process. So I feel like that has been addressed here, and I'm grateful for that. To the question that was just raised by Ms. Schultz, I do believe that the school board members individually and as a whole are elected to represent the wishes of the community, whether they come to us directly in a public forum or privately, and so that it should be up to magisterial district members, and I think with the support of an at-large member, as was previously the case in our last renaming, to bring those concerns forward. And I think those were clearly addressed last time, and I think as we move forward, I think that's a good way to proceed. I have a bit of a question for the governance committee about the addition of the mascot piece. So I know when this has been a case in previous decades where a school has adopted a mascot that was not appropriate, that has been handled at the school level. I don't think it's ever needed to come to the board. And in past, we have always delegated that responsibility to the student body at individual schools. And I do not foresee I do not see any instance where the board currently needs to take action on a mascot. So I'd be interested in learning what's driving that concern. Are there current mascots that are of concern to board members, and just give us a flavor of what was discussed in the governance committee.
Thank you, Mr. McElveen. I believe we added the mascot because we felt that even though that has been left to the individual schools, that whatever choice they make should be consistent with the 1 Fairfax policy. So we weren't foreseeing that they would have to come to the board for permission, but simply that as a policy of the board, that we would say that any mascot they chose should be consistent with the 1 Fairfax policy. So it's not us dictating to them what it would be, just that it would not be something inconsistent with that overarching policy. But perhaps Ms. Keys-Gamarra had advocated for this initially, so perhaps I should turn this over to Ms. Keys-Gamarra if you wanted to add anything.
The only thing I can remember is that there may be a name that seems innocuous, but say, for example, someone may feel that the mascot of a Confederate soldier might be appropriate, or in their mind. So we're just asking for consistency so that if we want the name to be respectful, you also want the mascot to be respectful.
Thank you. I think my concern with this is that it actually raises more questions than it seeks to answer, because I do think it creates a shadow process by which the school board is, in fact, the arbiter of what is correct and incorrect, and goes by one Fairfax when determining mascots. So I think it adds on to the process of renaming, and that we will eventually have to review whatever mascot is brought forward. So that's a concern, in that it's creating potentially more work for us than we have taken on in the past. So I don't know if I would support adding this. Of course, just like any board member here, I believe that all of us want mascots to represent One Fairfax. I just don't know if we want the board to have that responsibility for every school. Thank you.
Thank you. Mrs. Strauss?
Thank you. I just want to provide a little bit of information regarding Ms. Keys-Gamar's question about delegating the regulation to this. The one thing that I've noted is that usually with regulations, we indicate the dates at which that regulation has been reviewed or changed over time. School board, as long as I've been, since the 80s, there's always been a regulation on name change or not, or what have you. It's been reviewed, it's been changed, been vetoed, whatever. So it has been common practice, and I don't know the legal term for that, but it has been the common practice in Fairfax County Public Schools that the policy is fairly broad, and that there has always been a regulation that comes forward, is reviewed, the school board likes, school board doesn't like, changes, go back, fix this. So from a legal term, I can't answer your question, but there is a history. But I do note that usually, as with the SR&R, which is the poster child for a regulation that we do look closely at, we don't include the dates when this particular regulation was reviewed, updated, and changed. I might suggest that that would at least help to show that whether or not the school board has affirmatively delegated that authority in the past, the answer would be yes, and this appears to be when it was done. But I can't answer, I'm not a lawyer, so I can't answer your question. That's just the history. Thanks. All right.
Thank you, Ms. Strauss. Now we have Mr. Moon.
Thank you, Ms. Evans. Could I go to the flow chart, the slide where we see the flow chart? Okay, thank you. I'm looking at the proposed changes to the regulation. It's redlined. If board members could take a look at that. Yeah, that's the flow chart. So initially to the forum, a district board member, along with a large. No, that's okay. But I'm just asking board members to take a look at the redlined versions, redlined regulation, proposed regulation changes as well, along with this, because my questions and comments will go to, oh boy, public comment section, public comment period, and also where a couple of board members will have to come with a proposed new name for the board's consideration. That
Mr. Moon, would you like us to pull up the regulation rather than the flow chart?
no, I want you to take a look at the red, because that is equally important, what you
Okay.
see up there.
All right.
So initially, two board members bring the matter to the forum, and then if there's a consensus that becomes new business, then there will be a 2-week comment period where public will provide with a suggested names and or on the question of whether we should change the name or not. Then there will be a vote. Then if there's enough board support to change the name, the same two board members will take a look at the public's input and come up with a new name or a list of new names for the board's consideration as a new business, and then further public comment period, and then final vote. Is that whoever drafted the proposed?
That would be a question
Changes,
for
is that-
Dr. Brabrand.
Is that basically the process?
Yes, I mean, what I've outlined here was lifted out of the regulation that we've drafted. So is there a specific
So
piece?
okay. So 2-week comment period, initial 2-week comment period is between the new business and the final action
That's correct, for both pieces.
for both pieces.
To both change the name and to then consider the name that the school would be changed to. Because one action is to vote to
Sure,
rename a school,
sure.
and then the other
And
is,
then-
okay,
and
you have a
then
name.
After the board votes on it, and if that passes, the same two board members who initially brought to the forum will compile and review
That's correct.
the public input and bring to the board with a suggested new name or list of new suggested names.
That's right.
As a new business, and then there will be a further public comment period.
That's correct.
Of 2 weeks, and then final vote.
Right.
Is that?
That is correct, and as Mr. McElveen suggested, we added in the words "with staff support" so that it
With the
wasn't two
staff,
board
with the
members on
staff
their own.
support. So my very first, I think this may go to John. So when we do through regulations, tasking two board members to do the work, reviewing, compiling and reviewing the public input, and then come up with suggested names for the board's action, that whole reviewing, compiling and reviewing, that work is gonna be open to public? Because that is basically a subset of the board doing the board's work.
So I think that there are two pieces to that. Certainly, any emails or other communications between the board members or that the board members receive from staff or from the community on, public comment, absolutely would be subject to FOIA and disclosure. I think the second piece of your question is, would a meeting between the two board members be subject to the public meeting rules of FOIA? And I think the answer to that is yes. I think that, because as you correctly point out, they have been delegated or appointed by the operation of the regulation to do the work of the
So
board.
if the two board members will do that work, because we do basically prohibit doing the work of the board electronically, so they have to physically meet at certain location, could be here with thousands of comments, and all that's going to be posted, properly posted, so the public could see, and what those two board members may be doing is all in open.
I'd have to look at advisory opinions of the Attorney General as to whether all of the input that the board and board members receive from the public would have to be posted on a website as opposed to simply made available upon a specific FOIA request. I don't know, sitting here, whether absolutely anything would have to be posted on the website or not.
Because generally what the board considers, or a subset of the board, it could be a committee or task force, is considering, it traditionally has been available for public to be able to see, out of transparency, so whether that is what's been intended with these proposed changes. And whoever might have drafted this, I'm asking, directing my question to, yeah. That is a question. What is it?
I think Dr. Brabrand wanted to clarify about the forum topic, if that's,
Mr. Moon, I guess the question is, you're just asking, once the two people have the list of names, whether their activity is subject to public notification and review of whatever work
If the
they
two
were
board
doing.
members would have to review all the public input, could be thousands of emails,
Could be.
could be thousands of emails, whether they're gonna be all available for public to see. Just like whenever we do our work at the work session, all our materials are posted for public to see.
And so Mr. Foster said he would double check what the ruling is.
Whatever the ruling might be, I'm asking whoever drafted this proposed regulation, what the person has intended for us to do. That's what I'm asking. we could go beyond what the law requires. I don't know
Right.
who drafted this.
Well,
so that's
Mr.
where
Torrey,
I'm
Mr.
going.
Torrey, unfortunately, I shared with you all, Mr. Torrey can't be here right now. He is out. He worked with John and myself on this regulation. And I guess the follow-up is the next step. You want to know specifically about what the public notification is of the two members after they've received the names in terms of what documents and activity
I
needs
mean,
to
I
be made
strongly
public.
believe that. I strongly believe that our sunshine laws require is work of the subset of the board to be properly noticed, and public will have an option to observe, just like all our public meetings are, or have an opportunity to observe what you do, and whatever the board members will be considering, which means if they are tasked to review all the input, public input, they would have to be equally available to the public.
Maybe this will help. Separate from the law, if the board so wants to be sure that that is done in a public fashion, this is about the two board members, the two school board members working with staff. I certainly welcome
Yeah,
any
so-
and all
so-
transparency
so that
around
would be
that.
my because I know I'm out of my time, but another question that I have is,
Mr. Moon, could I put you on go back?
I think a lot of my time was wasted because people didn't know, whom.
Well, we did stop the
Okay.
clock, Mr. Moon.
Thank you. Put me on go back
Okay,
list.
thank you. Ms. Darren Kovacs.
All right. Thank you all for working on this. I was the person that brought it forward. And I also, that was a forum topic a few months ago. And I also believe in October of 2017, Mr. Wilson had asked for a review of this policy. So that's the reason we're reviewing it, for people who want to know. I guess, Ilyan or Janie, you're unable to give us history on the naming policy. I believe when you look at, we're talking about the renaming of a school. And then when you talk about the facilities naming, so guidelines, when you, naming a new school, let's just use that for an example. It says the school boards representing the area in which a new facility is located are encouraged to solicit suggestions for names from the community member. And I guess that's where we came up, we used that, but I'm not certain. I'm saying it's been something we've done consistently. It's been something that, for me, appears to give the colleague representing that area the primary outreach to that community with, another board member. But I wasn't on the board when that happened, so I just kind of throwing that out there for comments. I do think I am not comfortable with a mascot. I think that should be something that the schools, the colors and the mascot, and I think in this day and age to try to take on that and, like Ryan said, review it will elongate the naming process. And also, Mr. Moon, I am a bit concerned, like you are, how that process of work about collecting of the names, synthesizing the data. We all know that we have very limited, we have, we have half of an assistant who are very, very capable, but something like this, as you said, it has to be public. And I guess I would go back and ask what was the process used when we changed from Stewart to Justice, and how were those names compiled, synthesized, and then brought to the board? I'd like that question answered.
Is that for now or next step? You want that now?
Okay.
Okay.
If people
All
know
right, so
now, but I just need a
Dr.
refresher.
Brabrand, you can answer that question.
And I may need a little help, but I think my mind's pretty sharp on that. The regulation before required the superintendent to bring a list of names, proposed names to the board It didn't specify a certain number. I believe I brought you the top 5 names from the process. The earlier regulation had a voting process in the pyramid attendance area for that height, for the school to be named. If you were a pyramid area residency, you could vote in it. This regulation does not have that process in place. So I think the other regulation did not specifically have 2 board members involved. It had the superintendent simply produce a list of proposed names before the entire board. And I brought 5, but there was no set number.
And we didn't pick any of those 5.
Mr. Wilson?
I have 12
Oh,
seconds.
I'm sorry.
And I guess, Dr. Brabrand, possibly was that to help the board member because there wasn't enough ability because of some of the, things that Ilyan was talking about? Because I am concerned, as a board member who may want to put out a change, then this is the whole reason I was bringing this up. I'm worried about my ability with another colleague to, as Ilyan said, go through thousands of names and papers and trying to figure that out. I am assuming, and as Ms. Schultz just pointed out, we did not choose that name, so it is the board's authority then at that point, even if you do the proposed names, maybe we need more details in there as to how the synthesis and support systems will be in place to ensure that we have a clear understanding of what the public's desire is, or, a ranking. And I'll take a go back.
If I may on that, I think I can solve the problem. You're talking really about Section C. If in Section C, once the board has voted on a name change request, if you would prefer that the compile and review the suggestions from the community just takes place with the superintendent instead of the school board member, the 2 school board members, that can be done, and I would forward the recommendations of names to the school board or name to the school board for consideration and action. So if you feel like for the second part, not having a magisterial and at-large involved in the names, just simply, we'd have the public input, staff would gather the names and then bring a recommendation of name or names like I did before, which is what the prior regulation had me with the list of names. I could do that.
All right, I'll wait to hear from my colleagues, but thank you for that suggestion.
Mr. Wilson?
Thank you. So I think I'm going to echo my colleagues' comments about the mascots. I think in the governance committee, we didn't quite have as thorough of discussions we're having now about that, and I agree that that's probably a determination that's best left at the school level. And operationally, I think that if there is an inappropriate mascot that's discovered and identified, I think our superintendent is well suited to take the steps needed to correct it. I also would like to just echo some of the comments of Mr. Moon. I actually in governance committee, we didn't discuss really in any detail at all the regulation, but I think the way the regulation posits to establish a 2-member committee of board members to initiate and then subsequently be involved in the determination of a new name that's brought to the board, I actually think that sounds like policy to me. It sounds like, how we're governing as a board, and I think really that should be something that we need to discuss as a full board. It should have been discussed, I think, as part of the governance committee's task. With that in mind, I think also that in terms of the changes that are being proposed in the policy by the governance committee, in our discussions, I did not agree to take out the concept of compelling need. That actually goes beyond what the forum topic requested. The forum topic didn't ask that we look at the standard for when we choose to rename a school. To me, the compelling need standard actually puts up a level of discussion that requires that we have a very thorough and serious discussion. But the last thing I want to ask is actually a question for Dr. Brabrand. So right now, the regulation provides for a consistent process when we have a new school and we have to pick a name involving the community. The change actually keeps the process for new school names, but has a dramatically different process that's very streamlined and shortened for renaming. And I just would like to hear staff's thoughts on why we would have two different approaches for naming schools, either in the context of a new school or renaming.
So the answer to that is simply, we have a lot of things going on in staff to do, and we weren't directed to look beyond the piece about the renaming provision of the regulation, and I didn't direct staff to look at new names for new schools. That's a process over there. If the board wanted me to review that, it wasn't part of the forum topic in February, and so I focused only on the section around renaming. That's the short answer.
Okay, as one board member, I guess I believe that we ought to be able to come up with a process that's consistent so that the community understands when we're going to come up with a name or a new name for a school, this is the process we're going to follow as a system.
Thank you, Mr. Wilson. Ms. McLaughlin?
The first thing I wanted to make sure for not just the board, but the public, is that the way in which our existing policy is written, and it always helps to get feedback from the public to realize that maybe what we intuitively know is not so clear in the written language. And so specifically, I want to note that one of our local news stations ran a story saying that the Fairfax County School Board was going to be discussing how it sells the naming rights to our schools to donors. So when I read this, our policy language is almost brief to a fault. It doesn't make clear nearly what the regulation does. And so at the most macro level, I would say as myself a member of governance, I think this has to go back to governance, not immediately, but very soon. And if we're going to go ahead and update this, there needs to be greater clarity, because the way it reads, it's a little unclear that it's only a portion of a facility. And as we knew, we were talking about stadium naming rights primarily. But we interchangeably in this policy language use school and facility, and then it becomes a little blurry. And so to anyone in the public listening, please know we will not be selling the names of our actual schools. We will not have Nike High School. We will not have MicroStrategies High School or any other corporate name on our buildings for the school itself. But I do want to first make that clear, because people did have a reaction, understandably. To where we are on this, which was what we're doing in the policy in changing how we say, instead of compelling need exists, that is to ensure consistency with the One Fairfax policy, or when the board deems it appropriate. In the end, when we most recently renamed Justice High School, and it was a very difficult community process because it was new to us, and we certainly had to learn along the way. But anyone who attended the Justice High School dedication ceremony would have seen that had we led with that communication and message and mission and intent, I think we could have actually tried to bring the community together much better than what happened at the start. So when people have asked me about the board looking at this policy and what are we trying to accomplish, my goal has been that how do we show sensitivity to all residents in Fairfax County, ensure that the names on our buildings are appropriate, and that's why compelling need, I think, is actually more difficult to define, because yes, the board can, as the elected body, communicate out whether you think it's appropriate to have the name of a Confederate soldier on a building in 2019 or not. I think you can talk about, is that appropriate or not? Compelling need starts to get to, I think, a whole nother level of depth and debate, and that's not, I think it tears our community apart more than it does bring the community together. So to what we're looking at here, I will say that for purposes of the board work, I found it a whole lot easier to look at Superintendent Brabrand's facility regulation changes in red ink. I'm looking at our policy that we're talking about doing anything to, and it's unclear to me whether, because it says here, the last time that we updated this was June 2017. So this should be in red so that we do know this is the exact language that we're looking to change. But all that being said, the process, so in other words, I feel
Ms.
that.
McLaughlin?
Yes,
You're-
I
you're
ran out
at
of
your
time.
three,
All right,
yes.
I'll end
You
with
wanna-
this, Ms. Evans, because I think it's going to drive this conversation for the rest of the work session. This feels a little messy right now because I feel like we're having two different conversations. One is what are we wanting to do with our policy that is our direct responsibility? And then how do we want to provide feedback to the superintendent on the regulation that very much impacts how we execute this? And I will end with this. Every time our policy is so limited in language, we defer all decision-making to the superintendent. That's what I'm not comfortable about the regulation. It's all in the regulation, and no one knows where the board is on this. So that's where my worry is. We've got to get this straight and get it right and get it well. And I do want to also say 2 weeks is never enough on a big issue. We should be having a month for public comment
Can I
on
put you
both.
on a go back? Do you want to go back?
Yes,
Okay.
please.
I have Ms. Corbett Sanders, and then I'm going to take a turn before go backs unless, Ms. Palchik, did you want to get on the list? Okay, all right, Ms. Corbett Sanders.
Thank you, and I'm glad to have followed Ms. McLaughlin on this because I'm a little confused as to whether we are focusing this work session on the policy before us or the regulation. Typically, regulations are put together and enforced by the superintendent, and there is not a vote by the board on a regulation. It is the policy that we adopt and vote on. I do echo, so if I could get clarification on which one we want to focus on today, that would be great.
So I think we need to do both. The governance committee has done its job of looking at the policy. We were not asked to look at the regulation, and the regulation is in the purview of the superintendent. So if we wanted to give, there are two sentences that the
I'm
governance.
losing my time while you're.
Oh, okay, no, we need to stop it. But I'm just going to answer your question. You know, governance is proposing at the request of the board, and by the way, the board at the last meeting very specifically said, take out compelling need. We voted on that at our last work session. So that was our, we were tasked with taking out compelling need and putting in different language. So I think at this point, when we get to the end of this work session, I'm going to ask people two questions about the policy, you know, and unless there are overarching concerns. One is if we want to keep in the language about the mascot, because there have been concerns raised about that. And then number two, if the language that we have put in there to replace compelling need is appropriate, because that's been put on as new business. Now, the reg is a separate thing, but the decision was made to have both being considered today, right? And that, I believe, was made between, you know, at a chairs meeting.
So here's my concern. First off, the board didn't ask for any language to be put in about mascots, and I echo the concerns that were raised by my colleagues on mascots. The second is that we do have some lack of clarity in this policy document as written today. At a minimum, we need to break out the responsibility of the school board paragraph so it doesn't run on from the additions made by governance right into talking about selling the naming rights of public schools. So there needs to be clear clarification between those two. And I am a little concerned with actually a lot concerned with, essentially, we just took out the words compelling needs and we put in consistent with one Fairfax policy. And it seems like we've lost that clarity, which was in the original forum topic by Ms. Derenak-Kofax as to how we interpreted that. And so I believe that we need to do more on that clarity, as well as going to the regulation, I am very concerned, I'm glad Mr. Wilson raised it, regarding the inconsistency between Section 3 and Section 3D and E, and Section 4, because in Section E of 3, we clearly state that there should be a longer period of time than what is in the Section 4, and that we say a preference for names reflecting geographic and historical features of an area. And submission of commercially adopted subdivision names is strongly discouraged. That's a really important piece there, because when you look at that, I think that provides some guidance that should inform the Section 4, because they should be, you know, this was put in as we started to build new buildings again, and now what we're doing with this regulation and the policy is saying, okay, after, you know, as long as FCPS has been in existence, when we change names, what should we be taking into account? And it seems like we've lost that between the two sections.
Thank you. I do have several go-backs. I'm going to take a turn before we do that. I'm just mainly going to make a few points, and I'll probably have more to talk about. I agree about how the renaming reg needs to be consistent with the naming reg. Right now, the way the reg reads, it is a very, very different process. And I don't see any rationale for it being such a different process. The naming process, I've been through 2 naming processes. It involves a community meeting, it involves a weighted vote. And when we did the Justice High School name change, we tried to follow that general plan. We did have a renaming reg in there, and there was a community meeting and there was a vote. I think that the regs, whether it's a naming or a renaming, it should be consistent. Either we have a community meeting. I think it's probably time to get away from the weighted vote. It doesn't have a whole lot of meaning to have a weighted vote. I think we need, whether we have a community meeting or whether we have a hearing and public comment, it should be consistent with naming and renaming, because basically it's at the end of the day, we're naming a school. So I think that's something that we need to task the superintendent with. As far as the process, with the forum topic and the magisterial district and the at-large member, that was something that Dr. Garza put in when we asked her to create a renaming plan. You know, that, and we have used it once, and Mr. McElveen and I brought a forum topic. We had a majority vote to move forward. So I think it's important to realize that if we have a forum topic, it still requires a majority vote of the board to move forward. If somebody brings a forum topic and we vote against it, then it doesn't move forward. I would suggest, my own view is, why are we reinventing the wheel on this? Why not just simply use a forum topic the way we always have a forum topic? Any board member can bring a forum topic. And I understand the desire to have the magisterial board member involved in this, but I would say that there are certainly ways for us to be respectful of a magisterial board member and at-large board members. I don't know that too many magisterial board members would bring a forum topic, but at this point, any board member can bring any forum topic. So I don't know why this would be different. I think we should simply be consistent with our current rules on how we bring a forum, not get into you know, which board members can bring it. Just, I think we should have any board member be able to bring it. And I do agree, too, that we need to have robust public engagement. Perhaps the public engagement on justice was at times too robust, but too involved. Let's not say too robust. It was a prolonged process, and we don't want to have that prolonged a process. But I think 2 weeks between bringing up the idea of a name change and coming to a resolution about it is not long enough. So I do think that we need to have consistency, and I see Ms. Palchik now would like to speak.
No, thank you. It's been helpful to hear my colleagues' comments before responding, and I agree with a lot of what was said. I also agree with what you're saying, Ms. Evans. I think in our last conversation, I believe maybe Ms. Keys-Gamarra brought this up, the role of the at-large versus the magisterial districts in this issue, or really any issue. And I also was on the leaning that it really should be any board member. They are all of our schools. And as long as it's coming forward, if we decide the forum topic is the best avenue, I'm okay with that. I don't know. I know other districts are creating a committee, whether it's a committee of the board or not. I know we want to be cautious around what a committee. Yeah. So I don't know that we've fully refined after the forum topic kind of what is the best next step. I don't know that I have it clear in my mind yet. Keeping in mind the size of our system and the size of our board, and the need to do things, like you said, with public input, and figuring out what's the right balance. So I agree also that 2 weeks does not sound like enough time, but the time and also the way we take in input and who is making those final decisions, I think those are kind of the areas that we needed to refine, knowing that that final decision does come up to, it is a board decision, correct? And so I guess I'm leaning toward that, I thought we had gone away from just one of the magisterial members and one of the at-large members, and perhaps just any member or any two members of the board, however we want to decide that. That's all I have for now.
Thanks very much. I now will go to go-backs, and I have Ms. Keys-Gamarra.
So I just want to clarify, and thank you, Mr. Wilson and Sandy, because you guys went to the question of original authority, which is where I was trying to go in my questioning of Mr. Foster. And for that reason, I was explaining to Ms. Darnell Koufax, the reasons for my questions are not limited to this, because it goes to how we as a board have to be concerned about regulations and how we are. The veto power is not an assurance to me that the regulation is within the authority as delegated by the statute. So the question becomes, who's watching the hen house? So I will make that question a next step, because I do still need an answer to the question. I understand that Hutton and Williams did not produce a document, but there was a discussion, and then there was a medical problem. I think that discussion went a bit more to the authority. That's what I'm trying to get to, okay?
Could you, could you articulate
Stop my
what your,
time.
could you articulate what your next step is specifically? What legal?
Yes. If a regulation directs the board's operations, and Mr. Wilson pointed out that that was policy, so I'm sorry, that was a paragraph that I'll just repeat. If a regulation directs the board's operations, or could be construed to be policy, thank you, Mr. Wilson, what is the source of authority for said direction from the superintendent? I'm trying to identify that, because then we as a board need to be concerned, if there isn't some procedure by which those regulations are falling within the authority as given by the Virginia legislature, then we have a bigger problem than I'm aware of. That's number one. With respect to compelling need, thank you. We absolutely need to move away from that. In litigation, you do not want to have a phrase that is undefined. And all that did was produce an opportunity, because we didn't define what compelling need is. So I just agree with that. With respect to the mascot, I think that could be handled by the regs, but I'll hear my colleagues on that. I do thank you, Ms. Palchak, with respect to getting away from this magisterial versus at large. If we look at our policy, we don't similarly separate. We do say 2 board members, but we all represent, at-larges represent the various regions, et cetera. And so I think my concern is, we don't know what's coming down the pike. We're going to have a great deal of turnover on this board. If we get into a situation where perhaps a magisterial person, and I'm not claiming any, I have to anticipate what could happen. say, for example, members of the community have raised a concern, but that particular magisterial district person doesn't agree, then if we write it the way it's written, according to the regulation, the board's hands are tied until we can get around that. I don't think that we should be doing that. So that is another level that I'm concerned about. And so I do think we have to anticipate what problems can arise. Thank you. I think I'm at 0 again.
Thank you. Ms. Schultz?
Sorry, don't start that. I haven't started. I'm trying to figure out where to start. With respect to the fact that there was a request to review this, it's one thing to review it. It's because we paid an unknown sum. I still don't know what the bill is for changing Stewart to Justice. That's one reason to review a policy, because we got goat roped into a very long, complicated process. Are there any schools being contemplated? Because, I find that we are once again spending an inordinate amount of time talking about an agenda item that has nothing to do with academic achievement. I don't understand why this board keeps going down the road of talking about things that have financial impact. There's no money associated with this whatsoever. This is not fiscal prudence to spend our time talking about spending taxpayer money to change the name on buildings. If we remove, and whether we voted on it before or not, we can change our vote from the past. If you remove compelling need, which we originally inserted to start this whole process to begin with, and the fact that Dr. Garza came up with it so that one board member could bring forward that started everything that is accumulated to this point, doesn't mean a hill of beans. At this point, we have the ability to say, it had better be a very compelling need for us to go down the path of getting off the business of this board around academic achievement and start talking about naming buildings and spending taxpayer money on it again. So compelling need is important. I would like to know if people have contemplated schools, because it seems like we're going through an awful lot of stuff. If there isn't a contemplated school and a contemplated name change that is immediately on the horizon, then let's get back to doing the rest of our stuff. This flow chart starts with the least transparent part of the way we do business. A forum can be posted with 3 days' notice on board docs. We never have to have a conversation on camera about the fact that we're going to have a forum. Then we have the forum, which is not on camera and is only an MP3. It's held in a side room over at Jackson that hardly anyone from the public ever attends. And you notice the first word there is, if consensus, we move on. So, under one of the two situations that's here at the table being contemplated, either 2 board members or maybe even 1 board member, if there's consensus, and they're not going to bring a forum topic unless they've talked to their colleagues. So they're going to have 7 votes by the time they bring that forum. Nobody's going to come to the forum just on a whim on renaming a school if they don't have the votes. So you've cooked up a backdoor deal. You have 7 votes, you come to consensus, and then we come across some kind of public engagement thereafter. I'm going to tell you guys, this is going to come across like farce. This is a farce in terms of, are we doing what we're supposed to be doing? Are we spending our time and the public's money the way we're supposed to? And what is it that we're really doing? What school are you targeting to change the name of? If we don't have something in mind, if you have something in mind, just say it. If you don't have something in mind, then why are we architecting a process that ensures public engagement is at the back end? I'm very disappointed. I thought we had learned our lesson. We did go through a community engagement process over and over and over again that yielded what was supposed to be 3 names. It turned out to be 5 names, and we didn't even pick one of those names. So we are embedding public engagement in such a way that it doesn't matter whether we engage them or not, we don't have to listen to them anyway. So none of that is committed to writing, that we're actually going to honor public engagement in an authentic way.
Mr. Moon?
Thank you, Ms. Evans. I'm going to make a specific suggestions that we do away with compelling reasons. Remove mascots from the policy consideration. Instead of distinguishing at-large and magisterial districts, let's just leave it to 2 board members being able to bring to forum topic. And as far as a public input is concerned, 2 weeks is way too short. It will have to be minimum a month at a time. And as I see the flow chart and the proposed regulations, that there are 2 distinct periods of time during which public can provide input. One is after the discussion at the forum topic, once the board decides to put it as a new business, there will be a period of community input. That's the first time. They'll be focused on whether to rename or not, basically, rather than picking a specific name. It's a renaming or not. And second time for the public input will be after board votes on the action item, whether to rename or not. If and when the board votes to rename, then public will be provided an opportunity to pick a name or names. And I would like to have staff to compile and provide a recommended list to the board for the board consideration. But it will be ultimately board which will make a decision, which could be different from what the superintendent's putting to the board. And board will have an opportunity to see all the public input. Those are my specific suggestions.
Thank you, Mr. Moon. I've written them down, and when we get to, after we have a few more comments, I think we can start making some decisions on these things. So thank you for your specific suggestions. Dr. Brabrand?
I just want to share all 3 of those suggestions around the regulation. I have no problem with making those changes. Honestly, I mean, I know this board has many things to do. The 2 board members instead of the 1 and 1, if that's what the consensus is, the 1 month instead of 2 weeks, and the staff, I had already shared after Mr. McElveen or Mr. Wilson made the comment that staff can do it instead of the 2 board members, or the superintendent can provide the list in section C. So I'm fine with all 3 of those if they end up becoming the consensus of the board for this regulation.
Thank you. Ms. Derenak-Kaufax?
I appreciate Ilyan giving specific examples and kind of herding us all together where there was, I think, majority of support. Well, at least, I'm not going to say majority, but I agree with the things that he has said. And there was an all-day work session, Ms. Schultz, to answer your question, basically where we talked about which schools are named after Confederate, have Confederate soldiers, and there were, there were 4. One was in Fairfax City, and then there were 3 from here. So I think there will be several board members, including myself, who would be willing to move forward on some of talking about perhaps changing those names. And just to let you know, and for full transparency. And so that's all I have right now.
Thank you. Ms. McLaughlin?
First of all, I know it was mentioned that policy belongs to the board, regulations belong to the superintendent. But I'm very pleased that this board has certainly had a long-standing tradition that the Student Rights and Responsibilities Regulation, while again in name belongs to the superintendent, we know that it has a very important impact on our students and families, and so the board has always taken an active role in the approval of that regulation. And so to something that Ms. Keys-Gamarra, I think you were trying to touch upon earlier, it's very helpful to me, and Mr. Foster, I appreciate board members being aware that if there are things in the regulation, even though by virtue of practice and tradition, we focus on our policies, we know the intersection between the two is very great. And so it's important for us that even like today, do an analysis or review of our policy. It can't be in a vacuum. We have to see what the partnering regulation has to say. And in my remarks earlier, I think there's too much language embedded in the regulation and not enough of that critical language should be embedded in the policy. So I know that there is a desire in the community for the board to begin addressing some of other schools. Ms. Schultz, you had asked, what are we really driving at here? We are very mindful that we still have a high school that is named after a Confederate officer. And Ms. Schultz, to your concern about fiscal accountability and responsibility, nationally around the United States, as we know from the extensive study that was done and reported onto the board more than almost 2 years ago now, school systems around the country are looking at names named after Confederate soldiers on their buildings and saying it doesn't have a place in 2019, it didn't have a place in 2017. And so you're correct that we are elected to represent the public, and the public will decide whether they think we're taking the wrong action or not. But that is the reality. So I'm mindful that we don't want to keep dragging this out, but I guess I would ask my colleagues, because I didn't hear necessarily a response to some of the things I raised. If we're revising and formally voting on the policy, because right now we've just had work session discussions on the policy and compelling need versus appropriate, do we want to have how do we address the fact that I think there's missing language? Do I just take that as an amendment, and because are we so short on time that we don't send this back to governance? I just give an amendment to
So,
fix
Ms.
the policy language?
Ms. McLaughlin, I think at the end of our conversation, I'm going to ask a couple of questions about what the governance committee did. If anyone has specific changes that they want to make, I would suggest they start drafting them now so we can consider it today. This has been put on as new business, and it's up as an action item on at our next regular board meeting. If anyone wanted to have another amendment after today, they certainly can bring an amendment there.
I appreciate that, Ms. Evans. So your direction as the meeting manager is, because I don't think it's good to throw up extensive language to fix, like pull this out of regulation, put this over to policy. I mean, I could do that administratively as an amendment so that I think that the policy is more robust and more clear. The other question I have is whether or not board members share my concerns about the policy being too limited and too brief in language, and will we want more than 2 weeks to be able to review that or not? That would be my only other thing, because if people feel that in 2 weeks from now, and actually it will, because today's a Monday, we're talking about 10 days from now, are you all ready to talk about embedding more language from regulation into policy or not? I'm just trying to have people think about it.
So I think the chair wanted to say something about, oh, no, you just wanted to go back. Oh, okay. Oh, okay. All right, next we have Mr. McElveen, though.
Thank you. So I believe we've made some good progress, as Mr. Moon has outlined and his suggestions. I will say that for the entire history of Fairfax County Public Schools, the superintendent has always proposed the names, and I think that that is how we should proceed. I think it's already a political process, and it overly politicizes it to have 2 board members meeting off at a determined time to come up with those suggestions. So I do think I would like the superintendent to continue to have that role. I do, Ms. Schultz and others have raised the concern about timing. I do believe that we need to move forward with all deliberate speed. We need to act with this current board to finish the important work that we've already begun to change these names and to build on the historical and institutional knowledge that is at this table and will not be at this table on January 1st. So I do believe we've all seen where the process works, where it doesn't work, and I would like to see action on the school referenced by Ms. McLaughlin by December 31st. I do not think we need to send this back to governance. I think governance has a full plate with other pressing issues right now. I think we have come to a good place on changes at the board table today, and we do not need to prolong it any further. Finally, I will say on the issue of how many board members and which board members can bring this forward. I do think there is a benefit to having an at-large member be one of the two folks that brings it forward, because the school community is guaranteed that at least two of its representatives are bringing it forward. If you have someone from Sully and someone from Mount Vernon determining that we need to change the name of a school in Braddock or Mason, I think that is concerning, and there is the institutional check of the forum, but I think it would be more, I think the community would be more accepting if we were to have two folks that do actually represent that community bring it forward.
Thank you, Mr. McElveen. Ms. Strauss?
Thank you, and thank you, Mr. Moon, for your very specific ideas for going forward. I agree, we can take the mascot piece out. I think we need to increase the time for the actual community, robust community input on what the name should actually be. And thank you, Ms. McLaughlin, for reminding that, yes, we did ask for school names that were honoring Confederate soldiers, and that is where our concern lies. Thank you for bringing that forward. As for two school board members, I think there still needs to be two school board members. I would be more comfortable with an at-large and a magisterial, but I'm kind of open to everybody else because a school naming, school renaming, the person who represents that community is more closely in touch. And I've been through two naming situations, and they are very interesting. They can be a lot of fun, but you do have often deeper understanding of what your community is interested in. But at any rate, I think we do need to move forward. And again, thank you, Mr. Moon. That was very wise.
Ms. Corbett Sanders, because that's a second go back.
Yeah, so-
Ms. Corbett Sanders.
Okay.
Just a point of clarification, and I agree with Ms. McLaughlin that more words and more clarity in our policy is better. I am a little uncomfortable with the language that says, or when the board deems it appropriate. Is that meant to substitute for compelling need? Or where did that language come from? And you
That
can
is-
stop me.
Sure. We had a discussion about that, whether we simply stop at 1 Fairfax, and then we started thinking of other possible times when it might have nothing to do with 1 Fairfax, but the board might think that the current name was inappropriate for other reasons. And so we wanted to give the board the opportunity to say this name simply isn't appropriate and we need a different name. So we thought it needed to be, that was our thinking of on governance, that we didn't think that it should be only as a result of 1 Fairfax. It should include 1 Fairfax, but be open to other reasons for a needed change.
Where is the process for defining what that needed change is? So I guess my question is that where you, and we go back and forth of pulling out the term compelling need or augmenting the term of compelling need with something that says to ensure, or when the board deems it appropriate, or consistency with 1 Fairfax policy. So I guess I'm a little.
That would be a judgment call on the part of the board. It would require a majority vote for the board to say it is appropriate for us to change this school name. You know, occasionally we do get recommendations to name schools after people, for example, and it's not because the current name is an inappropriate name, but we might want to name a school after someone, you know, as an honor, and that would be up to the board to decide. We believe that it's appropriate at this time to rename this school. That wouldn't have to do with 1 Fairfax. but it would have to do with, there's another reason why we believe it is now appropriate. But that would be part of the conversation. Again, I hope I'm speaking for the governance committee, that it would be up to the school board, a majority of the school board, to say, we as a school board believe it is appropriate to rename this school. So if you had other language that you wanted to be more specific, certainly we can talk about that today and bring it up as an amendment or today.
Okay.
I think Dr. Brabrand wanted to make a comment
I just
as
wanted
well.
to say, I sat in part of governance, just from a staff perspective. Just a couple of the other things I think were names where information comes out that wasn't available years ago when the decision was made to change a name, and now that information is here, which would give the board pause. Some of our schools are named after subdivisions. Arlington, with Amazon coming in, is changing a whole neighborhood now to a different name. Would you then change a school name? So it was trying to create, at least what I heard at the governance meeting was a little bit of a catch-all for some things that wouldn't specifically fall under specifically about alignment with One Fairfax, and there were a few things like that.
And my next question is, how does the change in this policy capture or relate to, is there a mechanism in which we capture the earlier forum discussion about One Fairfax?
So we originally, the original draft that I had exactly that language in there that was in the next step. And the thinking of the governance committee was that it was just unnecessary and too wordy. Not that it was inappropriate, just that it was unnecessary. So we simplified it. That's the short answer to that. But we can certainly add it back in. We could even call up the next steps, because when I originally drafted something for the governance committee, I took it directly out of the next step. And governance discussed it and said, we just don't need all of this. But we can put it back in if you'd like to propose that.
Okay. And then my last comment is, and I had recommended this earlier, but I want to make it as a formal next step, is that we delineate the discussion of the responsibility of the board from the naming piece in the last sentence, which says about the ability to name portions of buildings that after private or corporate entities that have made a significant contribution to benefit Fairfax County Public Schools. That last sentence
You're talking about
should
the
be-
reg now? Or
No, I'm
you're
talking about the policy.
Okay.
It's what led to the misunderstanding that resulted in a news story saying that we were going to.
That was not good. Are you suggesting a change to the language, or just clarifying for the public what we're doing?
I'm suggesting that at a minimum, they're two separate paragraphs, so it doesn't look like they are one and the same.
Okay, thank you.
And my mother will be very pleased because she called me about it.
Mr. Wilson, and then we have Ms. Schultz for, I think, a final go back, yeah.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So, I guess I'm going to just circle back. I mean, I appreciate everybody's candor today in talking about the reality of what this board desires to do and which schools it desires to rename, and the time frame for when they desire to rename them. I just want to focus just very specifically on the change to the regulation, because the changes are so dramatic, and they are dramatically sort of opposed to the community's engagement. The second paragraph B of the current policy says the action will be initiated by the school board asking the superintendent to begin a community engagement process for a possible name change. The process includes meetings, surveys, other tools to determine the extent to which there's community support for changing the school facility. I just want to underscore that names of schools are decades entrenched in communities. And I think the proposal that we've got, even if we add a little time, really doesn't respect what those community voices are feeling and how to give them a proper input. I actually think that the current regulations at least provided, perhaps cumbersome, and perhaps it was difficult, and perhaps too difficult, But in the case of the renaming of Jeb Stuart High School. But I think to go the other direction and say, well, we're just going to have a hearing, we're just going to allow people to submit their opinions, that takes it all the way to the end. The very first comment I received from the community was another blow to democracy when they read the changes to the regulations, because they feel like, well, now we're just not going to get a voice at all. We're not going to be able to have a say. We're going to be able to give our opinions. Maybe we go to a hearing, maybe we can submit an email, but there's really no direct allowance for what the community's will is. So that's my concern. Of course, I've raised this concern throughout the last renaming process, and I think that we run the risk of really consolidating too much power in the school board.
Thank you, Mr. Wilson. Ms. Schultz.
Well, I want to respond to something that Ms. McLaughlin said, because I don't remember what time we started, but I think it took about an hour for questions for me to get to, you intend to use this, and you intend to use it on specific schools, and you intend to use it immediately. So now we're down to the nut of the matter, is it's full speed ahead. We're going to do it, and not only that, we're going to do it with this board before December 31st. So now we've got that clear. What I didn't understand was the scope of the use. And Ms. McLaughlin said, and correct me if I'm wrong, that we don't need a compelling need anymore because schools across the country are doing that, or school districts across the country are doing this, which kind of we started, or we're at the forefront of it. So now everybody else is doing it, so we're going to do it some more. And it doesn't, therefore, it doesn't really matter what the public engagement is, because we've already decided that we're going to change it. So I don't even understand why we have this process up at all. If you've decided to change the name of schools, just do it.
I just want on record that paraphrasing is not what came out of my mouth, Ms. Schultz. That is absolutely not what I said, and I don't appreciate you trying to say, if I understand what Ms. McLaughlin said, because I did not say that.
Excuse me, it's my turn at the microphone. So if you want to go back, and we'll pull the video quote later, but what was intimated is there are people doing this around the country. Off we go, and if we don't need the compelling need anymore because we've decided to do it. And the list of schools were listed by Ms. Derenak Koufax, but then, wait, it's like a Ginsu knife commercial, there's more. Then Ms. Evans said that we could be talking about, occasionally we get requests to change the name of schools that are not because it's an inappropriate name. So Now I'm wondering, what are those schools? Because if the scope of schools are the schools that were on the previous work session, which are schools named after Confederates or who have, and by the way, that was not an expansive list. We have schools tied to slavery plantations, that's like 33 or more schools long. But if it's only those on the work session, then name those schools and just put it out there that we're going to change those schools' names. But now what Ms. Evans is leading me to believe is, well, it doesn't have to have an inappropriate name at all. We could just decide because somebody in the community requests it. So I don't even know what that scope is. So I've lost confidence that any of this is going to be transparent. It seems to me that the board in its current constitution has decided it's going to change some names of the schools. It's going to do it now. It's going to vote on it now. It doesn't really matter if we artificially build in a public engagement process, because you're going to do it by the end of the year. If I'm wrong in any of what I just said, please correct me, because I would like to understand what the process is so that I have an ability to go forward to my community. And it sounds like that you even have set up a process that if you don't like one of the names of the schools in my district, and I have one, I have an elementary school that is named after a radically, what should be a radically controversial figure. So are you going to come into my district and tell me, one of you with one of the other of you, and tell me I have to change the name of schools and nobody in my community can have a say? Wow, that really lacks transparency. So I just like to know what the process is. I think you ought to be upfront about it. And if we're going to change the names, if you're committed to change the names, just say it. Just say it and just do it. And oh, by the way, tell me what the budget impact is going to be. Because we did not pass a line item budget that says that we have millions of dollars laying around that's going to allow us to go around and do all of the efforts that are necessary to impose name changes on communities involuntarily.
So I have Ms. McLaughlin.
So, Ms. Schultz, I know that since you and I joined this board together 8 years ago, that this board has worked in a forward progress to improving transparency. And so it's concerning to me that today's discussion is trying to paint that this board or any of its body doesn't care about public transparency. The reason we're sitting in this work session is to be transparent. It's being recorded for us to be transparent. We are talking about a public engagement, which several of us said 2 weeks to decide anything that we believe is of public importance is too short, and that it should be 4 weeks. So for you to label this conversation today as a board trying to jam through and disrespect public transparency, I find that troubling, because not enough of the public actually is engaged in the work we do. And so when you start labeling like that, that's damaging.
It's our colleagues who said they want it done by December 31st.
You know what?
That is
Ms.
jamming it
Schultz,
through.
I
That's the
heard-
height of jamming it through.
Ms. Schultz,
Let everybody have their
as
turn.
you are aware, we have a body of 12 individually elected representatives. Mr. McElveen's the only person who mentioned by December 31st, hold on, even if it was more than one person, it was not 7+ majority. The body makes decisions, not individual board members. Please do not start painting the body by what you hear individual board members make. So
That's the question I asked for clarity on.
That's
I would
fine.
like clarity on that before we leave the table today.
And I just gave you that clarity that I did, that's the first piece. The second one about coming into your district, I did not hear that there's unanimity or even a 7+ board members to say that we will take the district member out of that bringing an issue forward. But again, this body, even in a forum, if two unrelated, when actually, as Mr. McElveen noted, at-larges are related to every individual district. So if the magisterial board member says, I want the body to know that this name change is harmful, it is not what our community wants, and here's the reasons why, if you present that compelling information, the body could very well say to those two individual board members, thank you for your forum topic, but we're hearing that the community isn't supportive of it in that district. No, they can, Ms. Schultz, because it has to come through the forum. And if in the forum, the two people who propose it, and they say we don't support it, then it doesn't go beyond the forum.
There's no community support at the
Okay,
forum.
it's-
That's before the community
Schultz?
input ever happens.
Ms. Schultz, you're elected to
It's-
represent your community.
it's
That's the
Ms.
whole point.
All right, thank you, Ms. McLaughlin. I'm going to take a brief turn. I do want to clarify that in what I was talking about, I have absolutely no school in mind in talking about the, where we added the phrase, when the board deems appropriate. The governance committee as a group decided that that would be something that we should add in there. It would be part of the regular school board process to determine that it was appropriate for this school to be renamed. If this board as a body doesn't want to include that phrase, we can stop it at consistent with our One Fairfax policy. We can elaborate on what the One Fairfax policy is. This board asked us to take out compelling need. I do want to reiterate that. We were asked by a majority of this board to take out compelling need, and governance did that. We did our best. We have provided a recommendation. That doesn't mean that a majority of this board has to take that recommendation. But I have no school in mind that does not have, that is just, that we would change for some other reason. But governance felt that the board needed to have the ability to change the name if the board decided we should change the name. At this point, if we don't put it in policy, then we don't have the ability to change the name if we think it's appropriate for some other reason. So we put it in there. The board as a majority can take that out. I have two more go-backs. Ms. Keys-Gamarra. And then we really need to make some decisions.
Okay, well, first I want to thank Mr. Moon because I believe that his lead off in summarizing what the majority seemed to be saying was that there was concern about the lack of emphasis or not enough emphasis on public engagement. That's what I've been hearing, even though that interpretation has been mischaracterized, I think. You know, we are an elected board, and I just heard my colleague say, when the board decides, the board is representative of our communities. So I don't think anybody is disregarding or not willing to listen. What I am concerned about is what I hear seems to be a tendency to say, well, I don't hear the community saying that because I may only be listening to a particular community. And that's the reason why we need 12 people at this table, because we all have connections to the community. They may be different than the person next to me. And I think every section of our community is important, and the fact that, you know, a neighboring school board member may not be hearing a particular section of the community doesn't mean they don't need to be heard. So I also want to respond to this whole thing about name changes having no relationship to academic achievement. I actually disagree with that, and I disagree with that based upon understanding of history in Virginia. I won't go into it in great detail, but we as a state just had a huge recognition of the year 1619. And about how the ties of the Confederacy and the laws and how particular groups were impacted and how that was woven throughout education, and it has historically negatively impacted people's academic achievement. And so I just disagree that there is no connection, and if anybody wants to talk offline, I'd be happy to have a discussion of history. So I agree with my colleagues with respect to compelling need. The problem with compelling need is that it was not defined. And when you have something that is not defined, it simply becomes a bone of contention. And I'm not looking for a bone of contention. I don't think this school board has to go and write one up to find one. The other thing is, so the emphasis on public engagement is certainly necessary. I do agree with two representatives. This board, as you have stated, Ms. McLaughlin, the board is going to be the final arbiter of whatever is brought, and we are all representatives of the community, and we do want to have an emphasis on public engagement. So I think that's all that I will say now. But I do, I don't like some of the mischaracterizations that I've heard today. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Wilson. You have the last word, and then we'll make some decisions.
Yeah, I don't think I need to add anything else to the conversation. I think it's all been said.
Ms. McLaughlin?
Just that I would have preferred that we are all one board, but for the 9 of us who do represent magisterial districts and what the community recognizes our role is to be their core voice, because we spend the most time in those districts, we live in those districts, and we get to know them so well. I didn't really hear any clarity around how the 9 of us feel if we, to Ms. Schultz's point, right now it says 1 magisterial board member and 1 at-large, and I did not hear consensus.
We're going to get to that.
Okay, well, I would just say that my preference would be, as of now, that it still remains 1 district member and 1 at-large.
Okay. Thank you. So let's start with the policy. The way I'm going to propose doing this is start with the
Ms. Evans, it would be the magisterial district where the school resides, just make sure my colleagues know.
Okay. So let's start with the policy, which again has been on new business, and we're due to vote on it in a week and a half. The 3 questions that I have down, and then we can go to the reg and see about giving guidance to the superintendent about what we want to do, what we recommend on the reg. The 3 questions I have on the policy is, do we want to include mascots or not? And then we go to the language on compelling need, the language that replaces compelling need. Do we want to remove when the board deems it appropriate? That's one question. The second question is, do we want to flesh out what we mean by consistent with 1 Fairfax along the lines of what was, and I need to go back to Ms. Corbett Sanders' point about, this seems like a simple change, separating the paragraphs, the first paragraphs on responsibility to make clear that we're talking about 2 entirely different things. So Madam Clerk, if you could go up to the first change. What I'm hearing people suggesting is that we take out the phrase that says, as well as mascots associated with these names. Can I see a show of hands of how many people would like to remove that from what governance recommended? All right, that is a majority. All right, so we will take that out. Are there any other proposed changes to what governance put in there? It's now very, very simple. School names shall be consistent with the 1 Fairfax policy. Okay, then the second piece there is Ms. Corbett Sanders is suggesting making the next paragraph a separate paragraph to make clear we're talking about 2 entirely different things. Where it says the school board shall also have the responsibility to authorize naming rights for portions of school facilities. Can I see a show of hands of how many people would like that to be made a separate paragraph to make clear that those are 2 very different things?
Could you repeat that?
So the very last sentence, the point being that we've got the naming and renaming, and then we also say in here, the school board shall also have the responsibility to authorize naming rights for portions of school facilities in order to provide recognition for private or corporate entities that make a significant contribution to benefit Fairfax County Public Schools. So Ms. Corbett Sanders is suggesting we make that a separate paragraph. So can I see a show of hands of how many people would like to make that a separate paragraph in the policy? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, that's a majority, so we'll make that a separate paragraph. Now, if we could,
Suggestion, and it's going to be no, but I'd like to make it. In the sentence, in fulfilling this responsibility, the school, where it says the school board shall make every right to respect the preference of the community, I think it should say, however, unless there is a compelling need otherwise to so the final decision. So really what that sentence says is, we're not going to respect the right. Really, the second half of the sentence is.
what is your proposal, Ms. Schultz?
I would just say the school board shall make every right to respect the preference of the community. That's it. That's it. Eliminate, or just eliminate what's after the semicolon. However, final decisions on the naming facility.
All right.
Because that undoes we'll make every right of the school board will make every effort to respect the preference of the community, period.
All right, can I see a show of hands of how many people? She's saying in the sentence with the word community and take out, however, final decisions on the naming of school facilities and the dedicating of areas of school facilities or grounds shall rest entirely with the school board. She's suggesting removing that.
That neuters the first half of the sentence.
Ask a question as to why it's a run-on sentence versus just saying.
I'm not saying it's a run-on sentence. I'm saying the point between however and school board in that second portion of the sentence after the semicolon neuters the first half of the sentence. It basically says, no, we're not really going to. I think we should definitively say that we're going to make every effort to respect the preference of the community. And full stop.
Ms. Keys-Gamarra?
So I think the reason that language is in there is because we are an elected body. And when we go and we do these votes, like we had the votes, you guys had the vote before I came on the board about Justice High School, the community can start to believe, well, we voted, therefore they must do X, Y, Z. And so to avoid the sense that, oh, well, we made the decision and the board abdicated their responsibility to make a decision. I think that's the reason for that language, is to make sure, while it doesn't say we don't, I mean, in the case of justice, right, that the language that you're taking out would not have allowed us to name the school justice in honor of the people that we recognize, which were names from the community. So the language that you have would not have allowed that.
Ms. Palchik?
We can just vote on it. We can talk about it, or we can just vote on it.
But Elizabeth, can you clarify? You're adding language or are you taking language
She's
out?
taking language out. She wants to take out.
For the love of Pete, for the love of
She
Pete.
wants to take out.
Eliminate
the
between
final
however
decisions.
and school board. End that sentence on community.
And not make the point that the final decision rests with the school board, which I will say is a bad idea.
If it's
So,
my turn, my
yes, Ms.
compromise
Palchik.
is I'm open to eliminating the however. However, I would like to keep the second section. I'm happy to make it, second portion, a separate sentence, preference of the community, period. And then just to clarify that final decisions on the naming of school facilities, they're entirely with the board. And that's the way it works, and that I would be
Okay.
happy to do it that way.
So we
Then that sentence should move to after the underlined sentence.
doesn't have to.
Final decisions on the naming of school facilities should move to after the sentence that's line consistent with one Fairfax policy. So that,
So let's take a vote on Mrs. Schultz's. Okay, Madam Clerk, would you please remove everything in that sentence after the word community? Oh, okay. So, Ms. Derenak Kofax, it would end at respect the preference of the community, period. It would remove, however, final decisions on the naming of school facilities and the dedicating of areas of school facilities or grounds shall rest entirely with the school board. It would remove that. All right, how many people on the board can support that suggestion? Okay, who opposes that suggestion? All right, so that doesn't pass. Ms. Palchik, you're suggesting ending the sentence with the word community, taking out the word however, and capitalizing the word final.
Yes, as long as, Mr. Foster, if you feel that that keeps the legality of it being the school board that has that final decision, while trying to respect the community's need.
Just so I'm clear, it would be deletion of however,
Correct,
Correct.
be
And
a period dropped where the semicolon is before however,
correct,
and there'd be a new sentence that says final decisions.
correct.
we move that sentence to after the end of.
But let me get that question answered first, if that's okay.
Yeah, I'm fine with the
You're fine.
deletion of however.
Okay.
okay, so how many people would like to end the previous sentence with the word community, period, take out the word however, capitalize final? All those in favor?
But can we talk about moving it to, okay, this is the fifth time I've asked.
I know.
Can we move it to after?
I am going to get to that later. Okay, how many people would like to make this a separate sentence that starts with capital F, final decisions? And take out the word however? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. How many opposed taking out? Okay, 1, 2. All right, so that passes. Now, Ms. Schultz would like to move that new sentence, final decisions on the naming of school facilities and the dedicating of areas of school facilities or grounds shall rest entirely with the school board after one Fairfax policy. Is that what you're suggesting? All right. Yeah, I don't see that.
I think it can, so first it says school name. We're talking about that we have every right to respect the preference of the community. The school names are going to be consistent with one Fairfax, and final decisions on the naming will be, it makes a lot more sense, and it, again, doesn't allow that portion of the sentence to come immediately after. Well, we're gonna try to respect your preferences, but not really.
All right, how many people would like to move that sentence, to flip those two sentences from its current location to after the one Fairfax policy? Can I see a show of hands? 1, 2, 3, 4. How many would like to keep it where it is? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. All right. Well, although we've just voted, and we voted to keep it where it is. So if, okay, go ahead.
It seems like we're almost to the Department of Redundancy department, because we say it's the responsibility of the school board to select names for all school facilities and to authorize permanent dedication or naming areas. Then we say, in fulfilling this responsibility, the school shall make every effort to respect the preference of the community. So then we then say,
Point of order, we voted.
let me finish, final decisions, and then we pick up school names. So it seems to me that if we're looking at what we're really talking about, which is that that when we pick school names, they should be consistent with the one Fairfax policy, it gets buried in that whole paragraph as to how we're going to do names. Just saying.
All right, so let's move on. So we're not flipping that sentence, we're going to, but we are doing the punctuation change. So let's go down to the second piece. All right, so the two suggestions that I've heard is to either remove to finish it at, with our one Fairfax policy, to remove or when the board deems it appropriate. And the second suggestion that I've heard is to flesh out the one Fairfax policy. And if we want to do that, we could use the language that was in the next steps, which was, I can find that. But let me see a show of hands, or unless there's discussion about the taking out the phrase "or when the board deems it appropriate." All right, can I see a show of hands of how many people want to remove "or when the board deems it appropriate"? 1, 2, 3. How many people want to keep it in? Okay, that's a majority, so we will keep that in. Is there a suggestion for elaborating on one Fairfax policy? Well, let's see if there is a desire of the board to elaborate on what we mean by the one Fairfax policy. Let's see a show of hands of how many people believe that we need to add something more descriptive.
Can I suggest we actually refresh the board's knowledge of what the next step from the last board meeting was, or last work session was?
Sure. Madam Clerk, could you please call up that next step from that board meeting? And in the meantime, sure.
So while we're waiting to call that up, Mr. Foster, I actually was wondering if you can help the board on this one, because we're very mindful that the last time we engaged in a name rechange, the board found itself being sued, and that's where clarity in policy language is so important. Because right now, when it says to ensure consistency with our one Fairfax policy, and some people will say, well, what does consistency with one Fairfax policy mean? So to Ms. Evans' point of, do we want that to be fleshed out? I'm thinking that obviously we want to, protect the board and the division from unnecessary lawsuits if we're more clear with our policy and what people can expect it means. So it doesn't have to hold up the policy, but I think we could see a benefit from having that better defined. I was hoping you could maybe speak to that.
I can read what was originally in there from what I had originally sent to the governance committee. It originally said the school board may also consider a change in the name of a school or facility to ensure an inclusive, respectful learning environment as outlined in our adopted one Fairfax policy, or when the board deems it appropriate for other reasons. And I can send that to board members. And that is directly from the next steps.
Okay, so Ms. Evans,
Yes.
that's really important, because if that is what the board said the last work session, and that gives the clarity that we're now talking about, why isn't that as
It's
a
not-
language option.
It is, and that's what we're going to vote on. That was the language option I gave the governance committee, and it was voted down. So,
Ms. Evans, wasn't that the language from my forum
from your,
topic?
it was from, not from
That-
your forum topic, from the next steps.
The next steps,
Right.
which was from, yeah.
All right, so I am going to send all of this to board members so you can see it in writing. So, we can decide whether this is a better way to. But I've just sent you the sentence. Let's see. If board members call up what I just sent you, board members should have that, because I did take that directly from the next step. I sent an email, yeah. So it's here, to ensure an inclusive, respectful learning environment as outlined in our adopted One Fairfax policy.
Right. So, Mr. Foster, again, as an attorney, when you look at to ensure an inclusive, respectful learning environment, by adding that additional language, as opposed to saying we're just trying to be mindful of our One Fairfax policy, I'm wondering, when you say to ensure an inclusive, respectful learning environment, could that be one individual student, two individual students, or one individual entity who says the existing name on that building doesn't feel inclusive and respectful, it needs to be changed? I'm just trying to get a sense of what's our legal exposure here, as opposed, like, is it more language good, or can more language make things more complicated to defend in a legal case?
So I'll speak generally. If the board would like a more detailed analysis, I can do that in the form of, written guidance to the board. I will say as a general matter that as someone who litigated cases for 20 years, general is easier to defend in court than having the specificity that, for example, that would be outlined here. And so my recommendation would be to stick with the more general language that is in the draft that was before this specific language was put on the screen.
With that, can I see how many people would like to include more description? How many people would support including more description, such as was in the next steps? I'm not seeing any hands. Opposed to doing that? Ms. Derenak-Kovacs, you had a comment?
I do have a question, Mr. Foster. I hear what you're saying, but I guess I'm asking this as a legal question, to have a link to the actual One Fairfax policy, would that be helpful in there, or would you suggest no? Because the One Fairfax policy is a 4-page policy.
Links change over time, and I think that my recommendation would be just to stick with the language.
Okay.
If anybody's curious.
Thanks.
Remember when we changed our website, like all of our links died?
All right, so I'm not seeing anyone who is supporting adding language. So at this point, we are done with our work on the policy for today. Again, this is going to come up as an action item on September 26th. So anyone who does have an amendment can certainly put an amendment forward on that. And please, of course, get it to us as soon as possible if you do have a proposed amendment. So turning to the guidance that we want to give the superintendent on the,
Do you have, are we going to go to next steps, or do you have them, or?
well, right now, right now, we're going to talk about the regulation. So if you could call up the redlined regulation. We have several things from Mr. Moon has suggested, and others as well. Okay, here's what I have, and then I'd like board members to tell me if there are other decisions that we want to make in terms of, again, guidance to the superintendent. We need to provide guidance on who can bring the forum topic, and the 3 suggestions that I've heard is what's in there now, one magisterial board member and one at-large member. I've also heard any 2 school board members, and then I've heard from myself, following our regular forum process where any board member can bring a forum topic. So that's one decision to make. The other one is, several of us had said that the renaming policy should be consistent with the naming policy, or rather, the naming policy should be consistent with the renaming policy. So I want to get a read on that. I'm hearing a desire for a longer comment period, perhaps 1 month between the different steps rather than 2 weeks. And I'm also hearing that the suggested names be compiled by staff and that the superintendent provide us with a recommendation rather than what's in there now for the 2 board members to be making the recommendation to the board. Ms. Palchik, you had other suggestions? No?
Waiting on general suggestions to review.
General suggestions for changes to, guidance to the superintendent on the reg.
So I just have one on the first point. I don't know if you want to start that conversation or if you're looking for additional points, I guess.
Oh, go ahead, yeah, go ahead, and you just want to make a comment on one of those questions? Okay, go ahead.
Okay. The first one, so on who can bring it forward, I guess, sitting here and listening and hearing the 3 options I think you brought up, where I currently sit, I think the idea of, I think you mentioned, Ms. Evans, of keeping it the way we have of having 1 board member who can always bring something to forum. I guess I would sort of adapt what we currently have to say any board member that represents the school, so whether it be a magisterial member or an at-large member that represents that school could bring it forward to forum topic.
Ms. McLaughlin?
So first of all, I had said that I do think it's important to have the magisterial board member who represents the district be one of those 2 people. And then I also said that at minimum, when we're talking about a vote to change the name, I think there needs to be a month, not 2 weeks. I think you can do a picking and selecting the name you can do in a new business to action in 2 weeks, but the public engagement process for the actual name change, I think, warrants a full month. And then finally, I'll just say to my colleagues, to my earlier points, some of this, I don't think we should be deferring to the superintendent. The board owns what we're going to do on this. So I have put into my calendar that I'm going to draft suggestions. This stuff that Ms. Evans is asking her input, we can give Scott guidance now, but I'm actually going to build it into an amendment and be requesting that it be put into the policy because we own it and we should be making clear it's nothing to do with Scott. I just think that we're going to be held accountable to all of it, and so it should be in our policy what we're specifically directing the superintendent to do.
Ms. Corbett Sanders?
So as we look at this regulation, as I mentioned earlier, Section 3E has very clear criteria for names that will be considered for new or existing school facilities. There should be some sort of reference to that because it looks like there's a whole different process for determining names under the renaming existing school facilities piece. So we want to make sure that that criteria is matched between the 2. I also think that we need to, from a timing perspective, the 2-week and 2-week is inconsistent with what is the timetable for the naming of new facilities. And so we want to make sure that they're consistent, and that is actually a 3-week timeframe.
3 weeks and 3 weeks. 6 weeks.
Yeah.
Okay, well, we can include that in our discussion about being consistent. Ms. Derenak Kofax, and then just a reminder that we're about an hour and a half beyond where we're supposed to be. So, yes.
I'm glad to follow Karen because I wanted it, that's the whole purpose. We wanted it to be consistent, the renaming with the naming. And so if it's 3 weeks in each time period, then it's 3 weeks. It should be consistent in both in the regulation. So I think that's important.
So maybe we should start with that. I've heard several people indicate a desire that we not just have the renaming portion be different, so different than the naming portion. Can I see how many folks would like to see consistency, both in timing and in criteria, and other methods between the naming and the renaming in the regulation? How many people?
Ms. Evans, I have a process question. The board meets twice a month or approximately every 2 weeks. So I don't know how you can even get to 3 weeks from new business to action item, because if it gets posted for new business, the board doesn't meet either 2 weeks later or about 4 weeks later. So I don't know where the 3 weeks comes from.
Well, I think the issue is to be consistent regardless of what it is. So I think clearly the superintendent's going to need to go back and revise the regulations, I think, based on today's conversation. So whether it's 2 weeks, 3 weeks, or 4 weeks.
How do you get to 3 was my process.
How do you get to 3?
From new business
to
action. We don't meet in 3-week cycles.
Right.
Or 4-week cycles.
So there was some, Ms. Derenak.
No, it was my understanding, so you go through that process, and if you're on this page, number 3, this would be a 3-week period. Roman numeral number 3 would be a 3-week period, and then Roman numeral number 5 would be a 3-week period. That's am I understanding this correctly?
It could be, but I think because.
For this particular example, if we were to keep this renaming regs consistent with the naming regs.
Or vice versa.
Or vice versa.
Or vice versa, because
But if you go to 3 weeks, then you have to default to that it will be 4 weeks
weeks.
between new business
see
to
what you're
action, is
saying.
what I'm trying to
I
say.
see what you're
You
saying.
can do anything you want within the
Gotcha.
window.
I
You
got
can't
you.
get
Thank
3
you.
weeks
Gotcha.
out of 2.
Okay. Thank you.
So can I see a show of hands of how many people would like for the naming and the renaming regs to be consistent? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, how many are fine with the renaming regs being different than the naming regs? 1, 2, 3. Abstaining? Okay, so we approve that, then, that we will make the naming and the renaming, we will ask the superintendent to make the naming and renaming consistent.
And just a point on that, the chair can call a special meeting at any time.
That's
To
true.
be consistent with the 3 weeks.
That's true. In terms of the comment period, since that was raised, there was a suggestion that rather than being 2 weeks, there should be a month. Yeah, so how many people would support turning the 2-week comment period into a 1-month comment period? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, that's a majority. And again, this is guidance for the superintendent. Now, in terms of who can bring a forum topic, and so we have 3 suggestions. I guess I will start with following current regulations, but having it be either an at-large member or a board member that represents that school. How many people could support doing it that way? So, okay, so this is who can bring a forum topic on renaming. And the superintendent had suggested that it be both an at-large member and a magisterial district member that represents the school. And so maybe I should start with that. Maybe I should start with the superintendent's recommendation is to have it be both, and be very specifically one magisterial board member that represents the school and one at-large member. Other possibilities are any 2 school board members, and another one is to have any one board member that's either an at-large member or a board member that represents the school to bring the forum topic. I mean, it would still require a majority vote at a forum, but it's just a question of who can bring a forum topic. So how many would support having it be one magisterial board member and one at-large member?
Who represents the school?
who represents the school. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay. That may be our decision. How many people can support?
No, that's not a majority.
No, it's not, but how many people would like to basically follow our general system now and have it be any one board member, but either an at-large member or a magisterial board member that represents that school community? Okay, that's 4. Okay, and then the other is any 2 school board members. Who supports that? Okay, so we don't really have a majority, but let's take out the, well.
How many voted?
Well, it was 5, 4, and 1. So, okay, so it sounds like that, it sounds like, well, at least, well, I will
Let's
say-
not have board members impugn the intentions of other board members at the
All right,
table.
so
That does not comport
it
with our
sounds
governance
like
manual.
there is not support for having it be any 2 school board members. And there's more support for doing it the way that it's currently in here, to have it be 1 magisterial board member and.
As a point of order, I think you just have to revote to whatever is the highest, because you've got to get to a plurality of the people at the table.
All right, so let's see how many people can support what the superintendent has in there now. All right,
Magisterial board member who represents the district plus
1 at large.
to bring the form to.
Current language, 1, 2, 3. Okay, so that is a majority, so we will keep that as is. And then,
Madam Chair,
Yes.
Just want to remind board members that, especially for middle and high schools, there may be multiple magisterial district board members.
absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely. And then the last thing I have
Sorry,
on
can I
the,
clarify? I don't have the language in front of me. It doesn't say the school is physically, right, because it'll be only one district,
it
so.
says a magisterial
So could
board
it be
member that
representing
represents.
one student?
Apparently, yeah,
Because I have maybe 4 students at one school.
that you would, yeah.
Okay.
Okay, and who can support having the staff compile the recommended names and have the superintendent provide a recommendation to the board? 1, 2, 3.
Which is historical
Okay.
practice.
So that is.
I'm
a-
just clarifying on the earlier, you can have a pupil-placed student, and that could be your one student in the school, and you could be the person bringing the name change. Wow.
Okay.
I got all the clarification I need, thank you.
All right, so were there any other, was there any other guidance that board members wanted to give to the superintendent before he brings us back? Mrs. Strauss? Hang on, everybody, let's listen to Mrs. Strauss.
Okay, the issue of the superintendent recommending the name, what has been the practice in the past, what is helpful is when staff helps to compile the list of names. And usually a number of names are forwarded, and then the school board has to figure out what to do. I am a little uncomfortable putting it back on the superintendent and staff shoulders to make that. But it is important that staff help tally what's going on. When I've been in naming processes, we get the tally, and then it's usually, well, these were the most popular of whatever, and even when it's a new school. And I think that's a better way to go forward, rather than having the superintendent.
Ms.
make the
Strauss, I
decision.
think we just
I
voted
know,
on it
but
that. So
it's-
we voted
okay.
that the superintendent
I
will give us a
tried.
recommendation, which is
Okay.
what we've done in the past. I mean, that is in our current policy, that
Yes.
the superintendent brings a recommendation to the board. So if there isn't anything else as guidance for the superintendent, Dr. Brabrand, at what point would you be able to bring us back a revised regulation? For our,
Well-
I don't know that we need another work session on it. because
My
we-
view would be just to continue to build the partnership here and transparency. I would have the regulation available to you before you vote on your policy, so that you can see the policy in
Okay.
concert with the regulation.
Okay,
I think that would be most appropriate.
okay, so that would be in 10 days.
Yes.
Okay, excellent. All right, so Madam Clerk, do we have next steps? All right, Mr. Moon, What is public?
That's no longer needed.
That's no longer
Right.
necessary. Okay, so we can get rid of that. Ms. Keys-Gamarra? Does that?
I think it needs to say, what is the authority, source or authority for that direction from the superintendent? So for example, in the vote we just took, the board authorized the superintendent to include in his regulation direction to the board. That's clear that we delegated that. When I posed that question to our counsel, he did not clarify that. So my concern is, with respect to not just this regulation, but any regulation, how we're monitoring that.
So you'd like another legal view, another legal opinion?
The opinion he gave me did not answer the question that I was trying to get an answer to today.
Okay. But you are looking for a legal opinion, correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Can I help with that just because I want to keep building partnership? I think as I heard the division counsel's point, Ms. Keys-Gamarra, it's this. The superintendent has authority over regulations, and the board has authority over policies. The board also has authority to reject a regulation that they do not feel is in line with their policies. But the traditional authority has been with the superintendent to develop regulations. The board does not review every single regulation in the system. So that's, in a sense, he answered in the negative. You have the ability to prevent putting a regulation forth that would conflict with policy versus the affirmative of having to sit and direct the superintendent for every policy. Not to say that there's two different points of view, just to understand the explanation that was
I still need to know where the
provided.
authority came from.
Does that read properly for you now, Ms. Keys-Gamarra? Okay. So the next one can be removed because we've already done that? Right, yes, but, I'm sorry, could you turn your, oh, okay. You just put it down there, okay. So we don't need to really look at that as next steps. Okay, in the regulation, well, so number 50, keep going then. Okay, well, do we have any other next steps that we haven't voted on? That was it. Ms. Schultz?
I believe that I asked the most important question of all, which is where are we getting the budget? Where in the budget are we paying for all these name changes? All the community engagement, all the stuff that's going to come after it? What's the budget for these? What's the budget by school? Which schools are we going to,
Well,
which schools
Ms.
are we
Schultz,
targeting?
We don't have any schools in front of us now. We don't have any proposal in front of us for a name change.
But as I understood the timeline, we're voting on this, and the intention is to affect, that we're voting on it. I know we haven't voted on a timeline. That's why I keep asking about the timeline, and I was told by a number of colleagues that they want this done by the end of December. I know we didn't vote on a timeline. That's the whole point of the lack of transparency about all this that I keep trying to highlight.
All right. Well, so Ms. Schultz wants a budget question, but I'm unclear on how we would answer that question because we don't have any proposal in front of us at this point.
So we're not going to do any name changes by the end of the
I
year?
didn't say that. What I said is
Alrighty.
we don't have any, we
We
don't have
won't
anything in front of us.
identify the schools so that we don't have to identify the money, and we don't need to identify the money because we won't identify the schools. I perfectly understand the circuitous logic of that.
All right, so Ms. Schultz would like to ask the question, how will we pay for these name changes? Which name changes, Ms. Schultz?
The contemplated name changes.
All
Any name change that is contemplated under this policy is going to have associated costs. How are you going to pay for it? What are we not, we already have a budget.
Okay,
So
Ms.
what are we not going to spend money on in order to do this? Because you have to move money in an existing budget.
Is this?
We have a
this is-
balanced budget requirement
Okay.
every year.
Ms. McLaughlin, then Mr. Moon.
Yes, because we're now almost 2 hours behind on our schedule, I'm hoping to move this along. Ms. Schultz, I completely appreciate where you're trying to go with this. We are talking about a policy and a regulation. This board and this body isn't making any action decisions. We're not. And the bottom line is that once, so you can't set a budget on an undetermined number of schools. Not a single person on this board is going to vote to change any name until we actually have the conversation
But
about
we've
the
already
proposal.
contemplated that you bring it to a forum, and within a month, you're going to be voting on it, and we have attributed no money to this effort whatsoever. So in literally 6 weeks from now, we could be changing the name of a
And-
school,
and Ms. Schultz?
everybody's saying, well, we don't know how much it's going to cost because we don't have a list. Well, we don't have a list because we don't know
Ms.
how much
Schultz-
it's going to
Ms.
cost.
Schultz, we
Let's-
cannot tie
let's-
up a
let's
conversation
go to
about
regular
policy and
order.
regulation
Can we go to
to
regular
budget
order?
and board action.
Okay, a couple of very quick comments, and then we'll vote on this. Mr. Moon?
Absolutely agree with Mrs. McLaughlin.
Ms. Corbett Sanders?
Ms. Schultz, given that that this is policy and policy is how we frame the work of the board and what we can and cannot do, what you are asking for is something that is more specific maybe to the regulation. And if you are suggesting that as part of the regulatory process, that the superintendent provide some sort of estimate for cost,
And
then that would be a
the
different.
cost should be included in the forum topic, so that we understand what we're ever voting on before we get to a consensus to change the name of a school, and we attribute no money that is not public, that is not transparent. So fine, we'll put the money, and therefore you have to know what it's going to cost in order to be able to put it on the forum topic.
You may want to suggest that, but that is not something that we typically do for every forum topic, because we oftentimes ask the superintendent to introduce new curriculum, new professional development, new changes, and we don't at the same time require a costing from the superintendent. And so, as part of our forum process. If you are planning, if you think that that's an appropriate use of the forum process or a new criteria for the forum process, I would suggest to you that you use the forum process to come back to the whole board and request that we modify our forum, our approach to forums to include costing.
Nothing else that we bring to forum has associated with it hundreds of thousands up to $1 million worth of cost. And we're talking about going directly into action with
All
public
right,
engagement and the
let's-
change of a name.
Okay,
And
let's go
so-
in order.
So this is different
Mrs.
because you
Schultz.
guys have made it different.
Okay, Ms. Strauss?
Might I suggest, we know what it costs us to change the name of Justice, and perhaps that, again, is a budget question. That question has been asked and has been answered several times, that is a known quantity. That, I don't know if Mr. Schultz, you'd be willing to ask that question. What was the cost to change the name of Justice? That is known.
All right, how many people can support this as a next step to how will we pay it for the contemplated name changes? Support for this?
Okay, I'm going to just submit it as a budget question, so you might as well vote for it now, because I'm going to get the information one way or another out to the public. So,
Ms. Schultz, it's not that we don't want you to have the information. We
That's-
absolutely do. As a budget chair
Okay.
twice, we all know what the cost was. It was approximately $650,000.
right, so we're
450,000.
contemplating,
No,
we're
excuse me,
contemplating
that was-
600.
Excuse me, I was asked a question. It was approximately 450,000 minus approximately 100,000 that the community raised for this. So if we want to get a specific amount, we can certainly get a specific amount, and that is a budget question. This is a very vague next step. The contemplated name changes, we have none at this point before us. So,
If I-
Great,
if I
I
just-
will change it to, how much is it going to cost to change the name of an elementary school, a middle school, or a high school? And if that has to go as a budget question, I'm going to put it in as a budget question because you all are contemplating submitting a forum topic that has hundreds of thousands of dollars of implication to the budget times multiple schools. We're talking millions of dollars here, especially if leaving from here, some of what people want around this table is to drive name changes before this board is no longer constituted on December 31st.
So actually, that is probably a better way to go, Ms. Schultz, for you to put in a budget question that answers.
Consider it
specifically what you
submitted.
want. All right, Ms. Derenak.
I think that's an absolute fair question, Ms. Schultz, but I think what isn't fair, where you're saying it's going to cost millions of dollars, that is inherently an untruth. Also, we have used the forum topic. One of the things that we have done, which has had cost implications, is we talked about changes in ESOL programming with significant curriculum changes, and there were no costs associated with that when the board approved that. So there is precedent in forum for topics to be brought without, and to move forward with them without knowing the full implication of the dollars.
$450,000 times 5 schools is over $2 million, is $2.25 million. It's millions of dollars.
That is the cost for a high school. The other school that had the name of a Confederate soldier was an elementary school whose costs would be much more, much lower, because the costs for a high school are due to sports teams, things like that, uniform changes. Elementary schools have none of those things. Elementary schools have signage changes, smaller things.
That's
with
exactly
much
what I'm
less-
asking for.
That's fine.
This is exactly what I'm asking for.
All right,
All
so
I wanted to
let's
do
wrap-
was just say, be clear, it's not millions of dollars.
Yes, it was not millions of dollars for the Justice High School name change, and you're right, Ms. Derenak Kopax, about 2/3 of it went to sports uniforms and equipment. Ms. McLaughlin?
Just because this happened at another recent work session, I want to again set clarity. All this board is doing is talking about revising a policy and giving some direction to the superintendent on a regulation. There is no action, no contemplated action by the body to go change numerous names of schools. None. I have heard one school that has been mentioned to me by colleagues, both in public and in conversation. One. So I just want to be very careful that we left a recent work session where the public was then led to believe that a policy conversation suddenly meant action by this board on specific areas within the county. I just want that very clear. The body of this board is having a policy conversation. That's the end of it. Until a forum topic comes forward, there's no action being taken by this body at all.
All right, and with that, this work session is adjourned. We'll give, let's say, 8 minutes for everybody to take a